Well, good afternoon, and it's wonderful to be with all of you for the MedTech Forum this year. And of course, there's no more fitting way to talk about remote care than to do so remotely, as I am today. But as mentioned, I'm pleased to announce the launch of a new APAC Med policy paper on remote care management solutions. That is the result of an ongoing dialogue series convened this year by APAC Med's Digital Health Committee. And I want to spend a few minutes to talk about our discussions and what we learned and the insights that we share in the policy paper. So to begin, I want to outline what this multifaceted engagement looked like that was driven by the Digital Health Committee to help advance the adoption of remote healthcare in the Asia Pacific. APAC Med launched these efforts to better understand the opportunities and challenges for RCM, particularly amid the COVID-19 pandemic, and with a threefold vision. First, to bring together government and industry for a candid, open discussion. Second, to examine the value of partnership between the public and private sectors as it relates to remote care, and highlight existing models and partnerships that are already working in the marketplace. And finally, to identify global best practices and ultimately make recommendations that can be implemented by partners and allies across Asia. This work began in May of this year with a private sector-driven virtual roundtable that focused on the global reimbursement landscape for RCM solutions, with a particular eye towards successful frameworks and strategies in the EU and Asia Pacific region where RCM programs are being reimbursed. Then, in July and August, APAC Med convened two public-private dialogues that brought regulators and policymakers to the table, together with industry, to drill into the landscape for RCM in Asia and examine how regulatory and reimbursement approaches are evolving, particularly in response to COVID. Ultimately, these efforts have culminated in the new policy paper that we're releasing today, and which everyone can find on the APAC Med website. So let me give you a little preview. First, we need to define what exactly we're talking about. Remote care management broadly includes any solution or technology to enable patient care outside of conventional clinical settings. And as we'll see in the next slide, this can encompass a broad range of both relatively well-established technologies, such as telemedicine, but also emerging next-generation tools that are rapidly coming to market. What all of them have in common, however, is that these tools have the potential to increase access to care among a broader patient population, decrease costs in care delivery, and thereby provide value across the entire spectrum of stakeholders, not simply for patients and physicians, but also for hospitals and systems, insurers and payers, and even broader economic, social, and population-based benefits to national governments. And particularly in the COVID era, these technologies have been proven to help lessen the burden on hospitals and on frontline healthcare workers while providing efficient and practical ways for patients to reach the point of care without overwhelming public health systems. So, to illustrate the range and depth of the category of RCM solutions, we've borrowed this classification from one of our panelists from the World Health Organization. In its global strategy on digital health, the WHO delineates two broad categories for remote care management. First, those tools that enable patient-to-physician engagement outside of the clinical setting. So most recognizable of this, of course, is telemedicine. But it can also include patient monitoring tools, intra-hospital connectivity, and so-called e-triage consultations. Second, and more broadly, are patient self-care technologies. And this includes everything from wearables and health apps to chronic disease management technologies, medical chatbots, and even virtual reality care. And our discussions this year and the resulting white paper focused on the more recognizable patient-facing technologies that shift the point of care into a remote context. But it's incredibly important to acknowledge the ever-expanding scope of remote care and recognize the tremendous potential that it has to revolutionize the delivery of healthcare. So let's start broadly with some overall themes that emerged from our dialogue this year. First, the COVID pandemic has catalyzed a significant amount of regulatory and policy change in the region, and that's opening the door to greater utilization of remote care technologies. It's been a teachable moment of sort for companies and policymakers as we are able to demonstrate the tremendous potential for remote care, particularly as hospitals and systems have been put to the test. And regulators have responded. We learned in our discussions of several new pilot initiatives in the region and other new policy frameworks that are being developed, as well as supporting efforts on topics like health data platforms that are critically important to the overall environment for remote care and for digital health writ large. But challenges do remain, and there's a tremendous amount of work to be done. And that was particularly evident when it comes to the need to develop defined reimbursement pathways, as we'll discuss. And that gap is currently leading to disparate coverage among patient populations, as well as disparate outcomes and impact. Now, as I referenced, the session that APAC Med convened in May was meant to look at existing global frameworks and innovations that might lend themselves as models for new pathways in other Asian markets. The panelists looked at case studies from Singapore and from China, as well as from Germany, where the Digital Health Application Regulation, or DGAV, has established a framework that is meant to help simplify procedures for reimbursement of digital health tools. The panels discussed several key questions that you can see here on the slide, covering both market access and reimbursement models, value assessment, as well as how to integrate market-specific evidence that can inform new policymaking in near real time. And the paper summarizes some of the key insights that were brought forward in these discussions. They touch on everything from data utilization to how to leverage existing models of care while developing new and tailored funding mechanisms for RCM, and also how to drive change from inside the healthcare system, and with the support of what digital health leaders might sometimes think of as more traditional stakeholders. Great perspectives from the German experience with digital health. And all in all, a tremendous foundation from which to build and to start to think about tailored approaches that will best fit the Asian context. Now, I also want to acknowledge that discussions like these are always more impactful and insightful when they can be grounded by real-world insights. And we've benefited from 14 existing remote care technologies and platforms from APAC Med member companies, many of which are already present in Asia. And these range from a connected home dialysis device to monitoring of implanted cardiac devices, teleradiology, and cloud-based so-called hospital-in-the-home platforms for chronic disease management, all of which are captured in detail in an appendix in the paper. And we discussed the insights that have been gleaned from their status in the marketplace. 10 of these products have been granted approval within the Asia-Pac region, although they're currently heavily weighted toward Australia as the most open and amenable geographic market. Companies share that these solutions are having improved health outcomes for patient populations and decreasing costs where they are deployed. But overall, the reimbursement status is underdeveloped at best, with only 4 programs gaining partial reimbursement by governments and 2 of them monetized by private insurers, with the rest being offered as free to use. So what did we find when we brought together our companies with government officials and policymakers to examine the landscape and the path forward for remote care in the Asia Pacific? We heard a few top-line themes loud and clear. First, the COVID pandemic has provided a singular moment to highlight the value of remote care, if we can get buy-in from all stakeholders to pilot new initiatives and responsibly introduce these solutions into new markets. Governments are experimenting with greater access to remote care amid the pandemic, but we need to encourage that momentum with data and with evidence from a range of sources to show value and impact. Next, beyond these initial pilot deployments of RCM, there is a need for policy innovation, especially when it comes to new frameworks for coverage and for reimbursement. We've seen growing momentum in this space when it comes to telemedicine, for example, but coverage model for other solutions, including remote monitoring and patient self-care, remain limited. And our discussions noted that RCM solutions are often uniquely well situated to explore value-based and outcomes-based funding pathways. Third, the return on investment provided by greater adoption of remote care needs to be understood across the continuum of care and by all stakeholders. That's where tailored, fit-for-purpose value assessment frameworks become critical to show that true scope of value that remote care solutions can deliver. And convening a range of experts and other key opinion leaders to validate these outcomes should be a best practice. And finally, it's a simple point, but education and awareness building remain critical. And it's not just for patients. Physicians are obviously a critical stakeholder, and they often hold reservations about how RCM technologies will impact their practice, including questions regarding liability and how RCM can be integrated safely and responsibly at the point of care. And as we've noted, introduction and adoption of remote care is increasing, but adherence to these technologies remains low. And that won't change until we can educate and build an environment of trust around these products. Now, as I come to a close, I do want to quickly touch on some of the insights that we've gained from our dialogue with policymakers and with industry that was held in August. There's much more detail in the paper on the APAC Med website, but I'll offer just a few market-specific items that we found interesting. Australia is a great example of a sophisticated market with well-defined market access pathways for new technologies, as was illustrated by the company case studies that I mentioned earlier. But as with many other markets, it still lacks a tailored value assessment framework for remote care solutions. And particularly for those defined as patient self-care technologies, reimbursement is not yet widely available. Next, Japan has, of course, prioritized digitalization as a national strategy and priority, and this includes adoption of digital health technologies. And this is a market to watch when it comes to access to and sharing of health data, where we discuss high-level initiatives to harness the value of that data to drive better health outcomes. And the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare was pointed in its guidance to companies and to new market entrants to engage with them early in the process and help collaboratively determine and demonstrate the value of new RCM solutions. India, on the other hand, provides somewhat of a counterpoint. There, we discussed how the ministry has prioritized telemedicine adoption for the last several years. But importantly, there are structural challenges that pose serious hurdles. Things like low internet penetration and the development gap in ICT infrastructure, lack of technical capacity and expertise, and patient hesitancy. And this drives home the point and the need for underlying infrastructure and other foundational elements in order to truly accelerate digital health adoption. Korea is the only Asia-Pacific market we covered that has developed its own value assessment framework that is purpose-built for digital health. And the Korean journey has been fascinating recently. Where telemedicine was previously banned by law, regulators have now adopted new pilot initiatives in response to COVID. But there is hesitancy and opposition from the physician community for various reasons. And that's been a big challenge. And again, it illustrates the importance of broad stakeholder engagement and education efforts. Last, China has set forth medium and long-term strategies that recognize the importance of digital health and are doing particularly interesting work to establish provincial and national level platforms to enable the sharing of health data. But here, we definitely heard concerns over privacy issues and about data security. Issues, of course, that policymakers and companies alike are grappling with on a global scale as they work to build confidence and trust in the new landscape for healthcare technology. Finally, we close our paper with a checklist of sorts, outlining some of the broad policy recommendations that will help advance greater integration of remote care into the national landscapes of Asian countries. We've grouped these into near-term, medium, and longer-range priorities, but you'll note that they're not overly prescriptive. Rather, they're meant to propose priority issues and areas of collaboration where domestic and regional stakeholders, public and private sectors can partner to make progress. So in the interest of time, I'll let you dig into them in the paper itself. But in the short term, this includes things like harmonizing the classification of remote care with international standards, with a particular eye on distinguishing RCM solutions from traditional medical devices within regulatory and policy frameworks. And building on that, we need to encourage a bespoke, tailored approach to coverage and reimbursement for RCM solutions. And this needs to be developed in close coordination with industry and with other stakeholders. And on the patient side, increasing the health literacy level with respect to remote care is critical to help promote trust and confidence in these technologies. In the medium term, we resurface that idea of policy innovation, recognizing that a one-size-fits-all approach to access and coverage will not work with respect to RCM technologies. Rather, they require their own reimbursement roadmap. And this second bullet is critical. That's the need to develop a fit-for-purpose, tailored value assessment framework that considers not only the value of RCM solutions for patient outcomes, but that also incorporates the broader clinical, economic, and even social benefits that remote care can bring to healthcare systems. And finally, we include 2 points in the longer term recommendations, although I'll note that these are not meant as actions that can be put off until later. Rather, these are elements that are critical to sustaining an ecosystem for remote care that is adaptable, that evolves to the needs of patients and systems, and that demonstrates the value of RCM to healthcare systems over the long run. And these are investing in a health data ecosystem and getting that right so we can truly harness the impressive real-world data that'll be generated by remote solutions. And finally, the need to convene and nurture a truly big tent approach of stakeholders across the healthcare spectrum to overcome structural or ingrained hesitancies where they exist, and to truly create an ecosystem of trust and confidence in remote care. So with that, I'll close by saying that it's been a tremendous privilege to partner with APAC Med, with the Digital Health Committee, and with all of the companies and policymakers that participated in the sessions this year. This is just the start of APAC Med's continued engagement and exploration of best practices to help drive awareness and adoption of remote care in order to bring patient-centric, life-enhancing, and life-saving technologies to patients and providers across Asia. So we hope that many of you will join us as we continue these discussions into 2022 and beyond. And finally, we look forward to your thoughts and feedback on the policy paper, which you can now find on APAC Med's website. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of the forum.